when you look at the long decaying curve, which went downwards for, I think, 12 or 14 weeks straight in terms of cases, hospitalizations, ITU and deaths, all beautifully curved down, not one single wiggle in it, despite we were told, to not go to work for a while, and then we could go to work. Then we had like Black Lives Matter process. We had full beaches at Bournemouth and stuff like that. So there were businesses reopened, pubs reopened. Come on, if these things had changed significantly the rate at which the virus moved amongst the population, it must be the case that it would be reflected in the death curve. And it is not. And it is not anywhere. These curves are identical in all heavily infected European countries: Sweden, France, Spain, England, or UK. They're all the same. And they went through the turning point at a similar time. And I'm just briefly going to describe something that's very important about that. And then they all decayed. And I think that's all correct. I don't think there was any funny business. I think those are pretty much correct. And the test, the PCR test, the swabbing, I think was being used appropriately in hospital to distinguish people who were ill with SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 versus something else, because they look rather similar most of the time. But I think something awful happened in the middle of the year. And there's something awful, and you'll remember this now, as the sort of test notion, as if testing more is good, and if we can test many more people, that's better. And so what happened is this PCR, polymerase chain reaction swab test, so-called Pillar 2, was rolled out with a nasty rumble. And they started initially, you remember, it was like, 10,000 a day, and Robert Peston and Laura Kuenssberg would flagellate Hancock and the Prime Minister, why aren't you testing more people? And so they gradually increased the effort, and they were up to like 100,000 a day. Now, the little thing you should know about this is absolutely fundamental. It's not true that if you test more people, you'll save more lives. Once you start going out there with an industrial scale test in the population, what you'll find is the average percentage of people with the virus at that time was about, 1 in 2,000. We know that from the ONS. ONS have done really good work. They're independent from the sort of Whitty, Vallance, Ferguson group. So the population as a whole didn't have viruses. There were still people coming into hospital, not that many, and the test was good in hospital. But if you use this test, turn the big guns on the population when only 1 in 1,000 have got it, then there's this concept called false positives, that a certain percentage of the tests will come up positive even if there's no virus in it. A friend of mine used to call it the Bud Light test. It'll be positive even if you put in the sample, you've got it Bud Light. And it's an unavoidable characteristic of all tests, and you need to know what does it do at the extremes, false positive, false negative, and so on. And I would have been fired in my first job if I was ever using a test and my supervisor asked me about this, and I said, I don't know, and I can't be asked, I'm going to use it anyway. So that's what they've done. The government didn't publish these characteristics, and I remember getting more and more. I didn't have any feeling of something seriously wrong other than just carelessness at this point. And I was searching the literature for what the hell is the false positive data? And I couldn't find it. And that's eventually when I got to a government document by Kate Barker. And she wrote on June the 3rd this year to SAGE, saying more or less, she didn't say this, so sorry if I've misused your words, Kate. She said more or less, for Christ's sake, don't use this test like this, because it's got an unknown false positive rate, and based on all the other tests like this, it'll be somewhere between like 1 and 2%. Now, you might not think that's a big deal, but she knew it was, and I know it was. So if you've got a false positive rate of 1%, then for every 1,000 people you test, 10 of them will come back positive, even though they don't have the virus. But if the prevalence is only 0.1%, like ONS said it was in the summer, only 1 in 1,000 are genuine, and they will be found positive. So I've just told you that out of 1,000 tests in the summer, 1 positive was genuine, 10 positives were false. In other words, over 90% of the positives were false. Now, some people have said to me, well, that's not true. The testing was done in test centres, and you were told only to go if you've got symptoms. I mean, yeah, that's good, but we all know people who've been told to get a test by an employer or someone at school or college or whatever it was to say, well, you've been near someone that's later turned out to be positive. We don't want you back at work, Dave, until you've got a negative test. So it is my assertion that actually most people went to get tests in the community who didn't have symptoms. And if they did, they could have had one of 20 other viruses. It doesn't mean it was COVID-19. And finally, here's the killer that destroys the argument against me, that they were all symptomatic and so you're wrong about your stats. The killer flaw is, we've all seen this. I've seen people have posted them. Councils are trying to be really helpful and they would be leafleting their streets in Bolton and in Birmingham and Manchester saying, in order to help us understand where this damn virus is, we're going to swap the whole street or the whole district or the whole quarter. That's what they were doing. That's pillar 2. And that's the only way you can test 500,000 or 300,000 people a day is if you marshal your forces and send your testing vans to an area and then you go and leaflet or even just go house to house. So I am telling you that all through the summer the prevalence of the virus was low. The false positive rate was unknown, but actually, as it turned out, 10 times higher than the genuine rate. And so most of the positives all summer long were false positives. And I can think of no reason, Sir Patrick, why you would think of doing this, knowing as you do, because you've the same training as me, that what I've said is true. Why would you do that? The only reason you do that is if you were interested in keeping people fearful. There was no other COVID-19 related stuff happening in the news, that there were still people dying, but it was falling and falling and falling and falling until it was actually like 10 a day, which may sound callous, but actually 1,700 people die a day in this country. It was effectively zero. I think actually they were false positive COVIDs anyway. So this test was rolled out and it's not stopped rolling. I think at the heart of what's going on is a failure of everybody initially to appreciate that when the virus is not very common, all tests have a false positive rate, and I think almost all the testing, and it gets worse, the more you amplify the testing to get more and more not ill people, the more likely you are to get false positives. And so we've got a permanent sense of fear. We'll never escape COVID-19 if we keep testing, because most of the results are false.